welcome to MuggleCast, your weekly ride into the Wizarding World fandom. I'm Andrew.
I'm Micah.
I'm Eric.
And I'm Laura.
The audience is Laura. It's funny, we get so used to the order of these things.
Yeah, now that we've completely confused everybody who listens to the show, it's safe to say Andrew's not with us this week, but we will do our best in his absence. This week, CHOO CHOO, we're on the Hogwarts Express for what's sure to be another lovely, enchanting, peaceful, safe ride to Hogwarts. As they say, the third time's the charm, and this year everything's gonna be A-okay.
Woo!
Right, everyone?
I'm
I
so
feel good about this.
excited for a therapeutic, idyllic train ride through the British countryside. It's going to be great.
Well, before we get to chapter by chapter, there was some pretty big news earlier this week that was confirmed. We did an episode on it last week, episode 606, but now we can say with 100% certainty there is a Harry Potter television series that will be coming in the not too distant future.
Woo!
On Max.
It's what we wanted for such a long time.
Yes, on Max, drop the HBO, just the Max. You know, it's so weird we don't have the sound effects. We should have asked Andrew. Maybe he can drop them in.
Oh, ring some bells and alarms and ooh.
Is anyone good at imitating them? Like, can somebody do the
Yeah. Well, how about we all do the I'll do the static of the HBO and then we'll all go wah. Ready?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Wah.
Yes!
That's pretty good.
I think we did good.
I think we did it. So
we're going to discuss more about this in bonus MuggleCast today, but just kind of the top line details that were revealed earlier this week. J.K. Rowling is going to be an executive producer on this series. They are also in the process of courting David Heyman as probably the real executive producer. So that was something that we had actually thrown out there. So it's exciting to see that they are going to bring back somebody from the original series that was very much involved. This is going to be what they say a 10-year project. So it's going to be something that we can talk about on MuggleCast for a very long time. And it's going to be on the same budget line as Game of Thrones. So that should tell you all you need to know about how much they're willing to invest in this series. And the cast will be completely new from what we're told right now. That doesn't mean there won't be potentially some cameos along the way, but we will get a totally new cast. But as mentioned, we will discuss more about this in bonus MuggleCast. But any thoughts?
Yeah, with the same budget as Game of Thrones, I'm expecting to see like all the goblin rebellions. We're going to see armies of goblins just, laying siege to London.
Yeah. It definitely does give them the ability to expand, right? Like we were talking about the possibilities of them doing episodes dedicated to fleshing out other parts of the wizarding world that are more referred to, alluded to in the Harry Potter books, but that we don't actually see. And I think we can get into more of that in this week's bonus.
Definitely. And worth mentioning again, episode 606, our last episode, we did go into a lot of detail about this potential announcement at the time. Now, obviously, it's been confirmed. And then Eric, I know you had called out on the previous episode 2 other episodes where we had kind of given our casting and thoughts around a Harry Potter TV series.
Yeah, so more fun than the announcement that we now know to be true, I think, is the speculation of what would make a good or our thoughts on what could happen. So please check out episode 483 of MuggleCast, where we did some fantasy casting, and also 566, which is where we gave all our ideas for a Harry Potter TV show. This seems to be, I gotta say, our ideas were so good that this seems to be the least creative or interesting of them all, which is not to say this isn't exciting, but it's to say we came up with a lot of really good ideas that I'd like to see follow this announcement.
All right, so it is time for chapter by chapter, Prisoner of Azkaban, chapter 5, The Dementor. And of course, we'll start off with our 7-word summary. And I elected to go first here, and I'll start with fear.
Beer?
Fear. We could try beer if you want.
Yeah, let's see where this sentence goes when we start it with beer.
We could do that on bonus MuggleCast.
To your fear, I will say about
The
murderer
abounds.
On.
trains.
There we go. That's what I was going for. I thought maybe like on train was, but I like how you pluralized it. So we're good.
Yeah.
So fear about the murderer abounds on trains. I think that's fairly accurate.
Yeah, I think so too.
Don't each week we say this is the one that's going to be redone at the end of all this.
Harry, Hermione, and the Weasleys start off this chapter making their way to King's Cross with their ministry chaperones. So the ministry is very protective of Harry. And this reminded me, and I think we mentioned this 2 episodes ago when we were doing chapter by chapter, but looking at the Order of the Phoenix chapter when they go to King's Cross, it's very similar. They have an escort, but it's not the ministry. It is, in fact, members of the Order of the Phoenix. So it just shows you how times change and priorities change.
For sure. Scapegoats change.
It is interesting seeing the shoe fall to the other side, and security of Harry being the ministry's foremost concern ends up being the Order's concern. No one else will do it in just 2 short years' time.
How quickly Fudge and company pivot. And I think, Laura, you brought up that in both cases, the ministry is actually wrong about the entire situation. So it just shows you how good they are at their jobs.
Right. Definitely a commentary on bureaucracy, and also the tendency for certain people in government politics to be overly focused on optics and the optics of their administration and how various goings on impact that, right? We talked about how Fudge doesn't really, at least from my perspective, he doesn't really care about Harry. He just doesn't want the Harry Potter to die on his watch at this point in the series.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't know Harry. I also think that by the time he does know Harry and he sees that Harry is going to like be defiant or that he can't use him, by that time he's already predisposed to dislike him. So it's like a perfect, like, getting to know Harry is to getting to know pretty much like a kid who's not going to play ball, which is a shame.
I would say a lot of that too has to do with Fudge viewing Harry as an extension of Dumbledore, because I don't think it has as much to do with Harry himself as it has to do with how Fudge feels about Dumbledore and the threat that he poses.
It's very accurate.
And actually, Stray Neasel in the Discord brought up that the escort in Order of the Phoenix is much more transparent, that they believe they will be attacked. As opposed to this book, Sirius, as we know him, and at least we have that context of being able to have read the series already, he's not going to try and, hijack a bunch of ministry cars that are driving Harry to King's Cross. It's too public of a space for him to get involved.
Well, that comes up later in this chapter too, about whether Sirius would attack Harry in Hogsmeade. And it is noted, and this is something that I never really appreciated reading this book a million times before as I did, that Sirius did apparently attack a muggle-filled street and killed 12 people in public in broad daylight. So the concern that he would actually attack in public or try and hijack a car in the middle of a London street seems plausible when you realize that what got him in Azkaban was, in fact, a daylight public attack.
That's a really good point. And one of the other things that came to mind is the exposure factor for Sirius too, right? If you compare that in Prisoner of Azkaban to Order of the Phoenix, right now we're looking at it from the standpoint of Sirius coming out of hiding and showing himself to the ministry and to Harry. But in Order of the Phoenix, he kind of gets caught for going out of the house and going with Harry and company to King's Cross, because believe it's Draco and Lucius Malfoy that recognize Sirius on the platform. So, in both cases, both books, you're dealing with Sirius being exposed.
For sure. And I think you had brought up the point, Micah, either last episode or the episode prior, of Sirius in both books being a prisoner in a couple of very different ways.
Definitely. Yeah.
He's never free.
No, he's not. He's never able to really shake that title. Well, right before getting onto the train, Arthur decides to offer up some information to Harry, but Harry confesses, hey, I overheard you and Molly arguing last night. And Harry says that he's not scared of Sirius because he can't be worse than Voldemort, can he? And I mean, I think this shows a bit of Harry's character in this moment, right? That he's faced down Voldemort 2 straight years. What could Sirius possibly have that would be all that threatening to Harry? But the reality is he doesn't know the full truth of the situation. He kind of only knows part of it.
It's really interesting that, and I appreciate that Arthur is able to step away from Molly's wishes here a little bit. He still feels, based on the argument, that Harry should know. Although it's still not the full truth, it very much feels right in the way that Arthur is just making sure. I like that he's cut off. It obviously works for a very good reason of getting Harry to wonder why he said what he did. But I just can appreciate that Harry knows anything about this right now, because if Molly had her way, it wouldn't be that way.
Which kind of begs the question, if Harry didn't cut Arthur off, how much information would Arthur have actually been willing to give to Harry? He just kind of assumes, okay, some based on what you overheard Molly and I talking about, but we could speculate a bit on how far Arthur would have gone. Also, if he didn't have to deal with the train, factor, which of course plays well for him not having to go into too much detail. But I think it's true. Arthur really does want to protect Harry. He wants to arm him here with information to ensure that he won't go looking for Sirius, which, as readers, that should also be a flag to us. Well, hold on a second. Why would Harry go looking for Sirius?
For sure. Although I have to think that Arthur, and he does mention this, no matter what you might hear, promise me you're not going to go looking for him. Harry's obviously going to hear about it. This is a really prominent part of the very famous narrative of the murder of Harry's parents and ultimately Harry's defeat of Voldemort. So with Sirius Black, a presumed mass murderer at large, of course he's going to overhear the rumors or the misrepresentation of what happened, which is ultimately what ends up happening later in the book, right? So it begs the question, would it have been better for Harry to have heard this from someone he trusts and someone who makes him feel safe versus the inevitable fact that he's going to hear it from somewhere else?
Sure.
I agree.
Someone like Draco Malfoy would love to tease Harry with this information. And that's really where you feel bad for him, because he doesn't have a lot of information as it pertains to his past. So even having somebody like Dumbledore sit him down and give him the backstory, I think could have prevented a lot from happening.
Yeah,
Dumbledore doesn't do that.
I was going to say, what's preventing Dumbledore from actually doing that, though? It's just Dumbledore chooses at the end of this chapter, not to jump ahead, to vaguely mention that using an invisibility cloak to get out of Hogwarts would be a dumb idea because of the Dementors. So he's kind of low-key warning Harry about not sneaking around under his dad's cloak, and tells the whole school this. But it would have been better and more direct for Dumbledore to just sit Harry down and go, hey, you're a target. Everyone seems to be just passing the buck. Fudge passes it. Arthur doesn't really get the chance and probably wouldn't go all the way in because Molly would object. And then Dumbledore, McGonagall, nobody is openly telling Harry. The only way he finds out is by accident.
And do we think it's fair that a lot of the burden here is being put on Arthur and on Molly to really decide how much information to give, to to Harry. That seems a bit unfair, in my opinion. That's where somebody like Dumbledore should have stepped in and should have explained the situation to Harry as best he could.
Here's an interesting point I had never considered before, and mad shout out to Danielle in the Discord for posting it. She says the reason that Dumbledore likely wouldn't tell Harry about Sirius Black and all that is because it would be admitting that his plan didn't work and he got the Potters killed after all. And I'm thinking, yep, immediately while reading that, I'm like, okay, that makes sense of like canon, because Dumbledore, that raises more questions than answers about how Dumbledore failed to protect the Potters. And I can see that being very sticky from a Dumbledore guilt perspective.
Totally. Because the question that always seems to be unanswered is why Dumbledore himself was never the Potter's secret keeper. Would have solved a lot of problems.
Yeah, and it's interesting why Dumbledore allowed it to, like, I get it, you want to make it a friend, but the Marauders seem to be the obvious targets, the fellow friends of James Potter. Like, you never saw James and Sirius apart from each other. They were like twins, the teachers all say. So who's going to be their secret keeper? One of their closest friends from Hogwarts? Yeah, duh. At least with Dumbledore, he'd have to put up like the biggest fight. You'd pretty much have to kill him to get the secret out, which is real hard to do. So yeah, it doesn't make sense to me really why Dumbledore just didn't do it or assert that he should do it, but then we wouldn't have the plot.
Yeah, I can also see Dumbledore thinking that he too might be too obvious of a target for Secret Keeper. And I can also see him saying something along the lines of, you know, his presence being needed to kind of control the situation. You know how Dumbledore is this epic chess master throughout the series. And I can very much see him thinking that he needs to be above the chessboard, as it were, kind of controlling where things are, where the key players are going. So I can see him thinking that taking himself out of that element and making himself a secret keeper would make it harder for him to kind of control the other elements of the, you know, what was going on the Order of the Phoenix's side of things during the first Wizarding War.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it just
busy.
feels... Yeah.
I
mean, also, let's be honest. Working in education it's generally not a very lucrative career. People who work in education do it because they feel passionate about it, right? So Dumbledore is maybe just over here like, I don't get paid enough to tell you the truth, Harry. We need Andrew here to do the Dumbledore
No, I was just
voice.
going to say, we don't hear
we
enough.
Don't need Andrew.
Laura's Dumbledore is actually very good.
It is. And for those of you who are upset with how we're, you know, talking about Dumbledore right now, don't worry. We actually may have a few nice things to say about him coming up. As we talk about our new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Harry and Ron, Hermione are on the train to Hogwarts, and they go into a compartment where there's this mystery man asleep. And Lupin is described as looking ill and exhausted, with gray hair and a shabby set of wizard's robes. He was also carrying a small battered case held together with string. Ron says it looks like one good hex would finish him off.
It's so mean.
So is there a bum on the Hogwarts Express? Like, what is going on here? This is probably one of the most hardened introductions of a character we get. But yet there's so much power and intellect within this individual. But the way we get introduced to him, you think that if he fell over, he would die, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's humble origins. It's hiding kind of, there's a very clever way of just like expectations not being what they are. Who knew when reading this the first time that this was going to end up being likely your most beloved Hogwarts professor? As far as why he doesn't get kicked off the train, I think it's because he wrote professor on his trunk, because Hermione looks up and it's like, oh, it's Professor RJ. Okay, this guy is not, we don't have to like talk to the driver or the trolley lady about some vagrant. But Yeah, I really like that it's just unexpected. And this idea that even a sleeping Lupin is better than if they were in it alone, because for when Draco comes by. By the way, I was thinking, maybe you guys back me up. We need a Draco sucks count for this book, because like at least 3 separate times in this chapter, I'm like, man, I wish I were counting how many times Draco was awful.
Yeah, he's pretty nasty. But Lupin holds him in check twice in this chapter. And speaking of Lupin, there's a really great piece on him on Pottermore, which we will link to in the show notes. And perhaps we can talk a little bit more about once we start to meet his character a little bit more. But it has some interesting backstory in terms of how Dumbledore convinced him to become Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Lupin is coming out of years in a really bad place, following the downfall of Voldemort and the loss of James and Lily, allegedly at the hand of Sirius. And now with the Marauders group disbanded, the one group who actually accepted him for who he was, he's been lonely, depressed, he's picking up odd jobs to scrape by. And Dumbledore found him over the summer, invited him to take this position with the promise of unlimited Wolfsbane Potion from the one and only Severus Snape.
Did he consult Snape before promising that, by the way?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Probably not.
There's also some really great information about Lupin's backstory, his parents, how there was this falling out between his father and Fenrir Greyback, which ultimately led to Lupin being bitten. And then there's a really sweet moment in there, I'll give Dumbledore credit, where he shows up at the Lupin household and, initially Lupin's parents don't want to let Dumbledore in, but Dumbledore is Dumbledore and he magics his way into the house and he's sitting there playing gobstones with a very young 11-year-old Lupin. And Lupin is super excited to go to Hogwarts. So, and Dumbledore creates the Shrieking Shack for Lupin too, as a place that he can go and transform. And so there's just a lot of really great information there. And so I'll give Dumbledore his due in this moment. But Laura, you have some really kind of interesting information here on the Wolfsbane Potion.
Yeah, and I don't have a ton of context on the Wolfsbane Potion, but kind of related to it and the fact that the Wolfsbane Potion was only, a relatively recent discovery, in the early 80s or 90s in this story. I wanted to note that Pottermore also says that lycanthropy serves as a metaphor for illnesses that carry a stigma like HIV and AIDS. And for context, with this story taking place in the 1993 to 94 school year, it's particularly poignant because the AIDS epidemic began in the early 80s. And even by the early 90s, there was still a ton of stigma about it. Here in the United States, AIDS at this point in time was the leading cause of death for Americans aged 25 to 44. And there was just a ton of fear and misinformation about these affected populations. And it feels really poignant because Remus at this point in the story very much falls in this age group. So I think that, we are very much intended to see something of a mirror reflecting back at us what our society has manifested for people who are, suffering from serious medical conditions like HIV/AIDS. And I thought that it was just really poignant that the Wolfsbane Potion was a relatively recent discovery at this point in the wizarding world because treatments for HIV and AIDS, it was something that really didn't exist when the epidemic first started. And it wasn't until we got into the 90s that there started being treatments for it, like real treatments. So it felt, I thought, like a very good metaphor for real world happenings, which is something that we see a lot in Harry Potter.
Yeah, it's a good it's a good comparison to draw as well, because there's no sort of structural or systemic support for werewolves in the wizarding world that we know. In fact, later on in the book series, when Lupin is liaising with werewolves, we see they're pretty much all living in terrible conditions of, like, they just are not being treated with any dignity. And so it's really unfortunate that the metaphor continues and just continues to align with people for whom the system does not support. They are socially shunned, outcasts. Remus loses his job for being a werewolf. It's just very telling that this is an intentional comparison.
For sure.
And he's not the only one, right? Like, this is one group that we see throughout the series that's treated in this manner. And it makes me think about the fountain of magical brethren that exists in the ministry. And it's like, well, are you really all brethren in the truest sense of the word? Or are you just kind of supporting the witch and the wizard that are part of the statue, right? So you think about goblins and house elves and other creatures, they're not treated well in this world. And, maybe with the exception of by somebody like Dumbledore, I think he is a great unifier in that respect. Again, giving him some credit. But I think we do see in many ways, like, Dumbledore brings a lot of quote unquote outcasts into Hogwarts. And if you kind of even went around the staff as we have before, right, we see Hagrid in this chapter become professor of care of magical creatures. And you could make the same argument about Hagrid being an outcast as you could for Lupin. Dumbledore
being the great unifier of the outcast, the poor, the tired, like a positive thing to say about Dumbledore. I can't comprehend it.
Well, that's okay. It's all out of convenience for the overall plan.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you for bringing us back.
Yeah, I had to bring it back down. We can't be too nice to Dumbledore. Andrew will be back next week and he'll bring the Dumbledore love.
I'm channeling
back.
Some Andrew. I saw Andrew earlier this week. So, some of the Dumbledore love rubbed off on me, I guess. But Eric, you kind of alluded to this earlier at the start of Term Feast. It's noted how angry Snape is at Lupin being appointed as Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. The trio surmise it's because he wanted the role, but his anger must also be because Lupin was a marauder. And later Lupin says that Snape doesn't like him because he thought Lupin was in on Sirius's prank to send him to the Whomping Willow to see what Lupin was up to.
Yeah, I mean, the word that's used is loathing. That's Harry's opinion, that it's loathing that he sees in Snape's eyes toward Lupin. And the reason he recognizes it, the book says, is because it's the exact same look that Snape gives to Harry. And I'm like, man, there is story there.
For sure. I wonder if it gives Harry some relief to feel like, oh, like Snape has somebody else to pick on this year.
Maybe.
I do think, though, Snape, we know that he's predisposed to hate anyone affiliated with James and Sirius. But I'm also wondering if in this moment, Snape suspects that Lupin might be a double agent working with Sirius.
Well, if anybody knows about being a double agent, it's Snape.
Yeah, exactly. So he knows what to look out for. But he also knows how close these two were when they were at school together. Everyone knows Sirius is on the run. Now Lupin is at Hogwarts. Sirius is allegedly trying to hunt Harry down to murder him. And Snape's ultimate mission, his promise to Dumbledore, and ultimately to Lily, he made that he made that promise to her sort of like in her posthumous state, but like his promise was he was going to protect Harry. And I'm wondering if at this point in time, he sees a threat to Harry because Lupin is there.
That's interesting.
Potentially. And I would maybe take it a step further with Dumbledore. Does Dumbledore bring Lupin to Hogwarts to draw Sirius out? Now, I'm not sure the timing of all of it because we don't know when Dumbledore approached Lupin about the position? Was it before Sirius broke out? Was it after? If it was after, you have to wonder what his motivations are.
I like that question a lot, actually, because it's using using Lupin as bait, or Harry as bait again, and Hogwarts as the backdrop for it all. Pretty dangerous.
I mean, last year we know that he effectively put Lockhart in this position to expose him as a fraud.
Yeah.
So maybe
that checks out.
Well, hiring for your business can feel harder than confronting a Dementor or filling a cursed defense against the dark arts position. But if only Dumbledore had Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's US data shows over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. Instant Match is a great feature because it takes care of the hard, tedious work for you. Just sponsor a job, and within moments, Instant Match shows you candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your job description. The right candidate is doing everything they can to find you, and if you use Indeed, you can be sure you're doing everything you can to find them too. Indeed knows when you're growing your own business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/MuggleCast to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/MuggleCast. Indeed.com/MuggleCast. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Let's talk about Dementors.
The title character of this chapter.
So, sometime into their journey on the Hogwarts Express, the train is halted on the tracks. It's dark, there's confusion, nobody knows what's going on, and the commotion wakes up Lupin, who does, as Andrew says, some cool fire in his hands magic to illuminate the scene. But before he can investigate, a Dementor opens the door. And this generally is a very creepy scene, right? If you're a young child who happens to be reading this book, this probably makes you a little nervous, a little scared for what's about to happen.
This honestly is the number one thing about the third movie that I think was perfect. Just the whole the way the execution of the Dementor as a creature. I don't love movie 3 a lot, but this was bang on.
And Harry faints after the Dementor enters the cabin, and it could almost be read like they were targeting him since he was the one who fainted. But I think it's fair to say, as Lupin talks about later, that Harry was just the most vulnerable to their presence. And, that's certainly sad to say, but it's also noted here that, Harry just didn't faint. It's almost like he had a seizure, right?
Yeah.
It says he went sort of rigid, fell out of his seat, he started twitching. Generally, people don't twitch when they faint. So it's almost like he had this episode that was caused by the Dementors.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are a lot of traumas that exist in his past that his classmates just don't have. But it is also important to call out the reactions that were noted for both Ginny and Neville.
Absolutely. I think it really does have to do with those that have suffered the most trauma. The idea that you could in one fell swoop lose all of your happy memories or simply not have access to any happiness and really be faced with your worst moments. Ginny, whose worst moments were literally the entire most recent year of Hogwarts. She I think comes the closest to fainting, and I really appreciate that it's in the text. If you really look at it, she's actively shaking and is worse than Neville's described as being like nervous, upset, but Ginny full on almost went, I think, as far as Harry did, and it's because she was forced probably in that moment to relive. If Harry overhears, Lily's pleading when he sees the Dementor, Ginny absolutely heard Tom Riddle in some capacity, maybe even just a word or two, but that voice would have haunted her. It's terrifying. And the other thing I like to compare the Dementor to, and I say like to, but this is my first time doing it. When you first get a tattoo and you don't know what to expect about how it feels, imagine you never encountered this being before that comes in and has this power that sucks all this happiness out of the room. Like the first time you encounter it is going to be the strongest because it's so strange and unfamiliar. And then in the future, it's not that it's any less strong in the future physically, but because you're prepared for it or because you've sensed or felt something before, you know kind of what you're getting into, and it's less of a big deal. It is how strange and unusual and even unnatural the Dementor is that causes everyone to kind of do a double take. And the fact that they've boarded the Hogwarts Express. We've never seen this done before. Where's the trolley lady when this was going on? She could just, swat him back. I mean,
she was on break.
Speaking of comparisons, I really like the comparison you had there, Eric. Another thing that the Dementors serve as a metaphor for is depression, right? And sort of the vicious cycle that depression can cause if you don't feel like you're able to access any, for the purposes of this story, happy memories to kind of bolster you and pull you out of that cycle, then you're extremely susceptible to it, especially if you're someone who has experienced a lot of trauma, just like Harry, Ginny, and Neville.
Definitely. And I know in a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the correlations between depression and chocolate, because chocolate plays a major role in making Harry feel better post Dementor attack. But I do think it's absolutely important to note how others in this train car are reacting. We talked about Ginny shaking like mad, Neville being very pale. And for Neville, I wonder, as a child, could he have experienced what happened to his parents? It's just kind of buried deep within his subconscious. We know his parents, Frank and Alice, were essentially tortured into madness, and we don't get like the full picture there. If young Neville was in the room when this was all taking place, or was he off with, his grandmother somewhere or his uncle?
Wasn't he directly affected? Because his the reason he has like poor memory and stuff, I thought he might have been actually directly attacked by the Death Eaters, maybe.
Maybe.
As a kid, it's horrible to think about. But I was picturing him being in the room. I'm not sure on that though.
Well, they were part of the Order, right? So they might have been out and about on a mission when it happened. But yeah, I'm not sure where exactly Neville was. Maybe the Discord can check us.
And it's easy to just pass off him being very pale as him being that, scared kid in the corner. But we know that there are definitely horrors in his past.
And present.
Yeah, well, because he's constantly being made fun of, and he's living with family members who aren't necessarily very supportive of him. So definitely.
Yeah.
Harry, though, hears a scream in his head, and it's worth bringing this up because this repeats many times throughout Prisoner of Azkaban. And we know that he's experiencing the death of his mother, and he desperately wants to help this person. But I don't think at this point he's able to make the connection to what it is he's actually experiencing, because he asks, right, the rest of the car, did you hear the woman screaming?
Yeah, it's that repressed memory that's surfacing because the Dementor is literally pulling this out of Harry.
Speaking of pulling things out of Harry, there's a lot of discussion that I think can be made here, and I see there's some comments also in the Discord. And just kind of wondering, with the Dementor having entered the train car, do we think that it could have removed the Horcrux, that piece of Voldemort's soul, from Harry? And maybe it's even worth taking a step back and asking, do we think that's potentially what drew the Dementor to Harry in the first place? This piece of dark magic that was living inside of Harry.
There's a couple of ways. I love this theory. I think I always have. But is it that Harry was an anomaly to them because these are creatures that very much can like sense your soul or your essence? Or was Harry like a feast because he's got like 1.5 souls in him? Was the Dementor focusing on him, not personally, but just because, wow, a banquet?
It's like a supersized meal for them.
Yeah. Harry's supersized Harry.
I did look this up a bit in terms of Horcruxes, and it said that they can only be destroyed by leaving the vessel in a state of non-magical repair. There's absolutely no way to recover from the Dementor's kiss. This leaves you in a state of non-magical repair or recovery. Therefore, the Dementor's kiss would destroy the part of the soul that is inside of Harry. Yeah, but it sounds like it would leave Harry pretty much dead.
Worse than death. Actually,
right?
If you have your soul sucked out for the Dementor's kiss, you're an empty shell. Although I don't know that Harry would be. If the Dementor had succeeded in killing Harry, or sucking his soul out, there's still a bit of soul that happens to remain in a living human body that is now in need of a soul to fulfill it. I think that'd be a weird and creepy way to reintegrate Voldemort with a body, would be to Dementor's kiss Harry.
Oh.
So you're saying instead of Voldemort's soul being sucked out, it's Harry's soul that gets sucked out, and Voldemort can then live within Harry.
I think that
would have made for a much better story.
Oh, then what?
Yeah.
This is a great story. What are you talking about?
No, I love this as like a what if story. But, even if that weren't the way that this hypothetical went, and the Dementor, sucked out Harry's soul and, the piece of Voldemort's soul that lives in him, the wizarding world would still be doomed because Voldemort still has Horcruxes out there. So this wouldn't take care of him.
Yeah.
Well, and Harry doesn't have that protection anymore either. That Horcrux is actually a good means of protection for him.
It's so interesting. But it's also interesting to me, speaking of Dementors, that they can be talked to, that they understand language. Like Remus, it is said, got up and said, "None of us are hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks." Finally wakes up. But I have always wondered, because you never hear a Dementor speak, but people always talk about what the Dementor's motives and intentions are. And so it's like, I'm assuming they can speak. You wouldn't like it to hear them speak, but they certainly...
They probably have really bad breath, too.
I think it's noted that they do. I think their breath is like, it smells like decay and rotting things. It's very gross.
They need like a whole pack of Mentos at once. That's what I'm thinking. But speaking of speaking to them, well, Lupin notes that didn't work. And we get to see kind of indirectly Expecto Patronum used, but we don't get told what it is. So more to come there in the future. But post-attack, we were talking about this earlier, Lupin gives Harry chocolate, tells him to take some, he'll feel a lot better. And there's some notes here about how chocolate actually can help with depression, which is really what the Dementors represent.
Yeah, and I think everybody feels this to an extent. Chocolate releases endorphins. And I know I always feel better after I eat chocolate. But the National Institutes of Health actually did a study about this, and they found that participants in a study they did who consumed more chocolate. So participants in the study who consumed the highest quartile amount of chocolate of all the participants had 57% lower odds of depressive symptoms than those who reported no chocolate consumption. So the data is clear, y'all. Have your chocolate.
Thank you for looking this up. I found it to be very exciting. Makes me want to go get some nice milk chocolate myself.
Yeah. So, well, speaking of the trolley lady, she could have been a very big help here, but
yeah, free chocolate for everybody. Look, money, like they'll get their money, bill Hogwarts or bill the government or something, but give out all the chocolate frogs that you have. They're probably close to expiration anyway. Give the kids some chocolate.
Yeah. It's clear then that the author did her homework here specifically as it relates to the chocolate, one would think.
Yeah. Well, also, she also has spoken very openly about her own struggles with depression. So I think there's personal experience here in terms of how depression is represented in the books.
I love that, like, Lupin immediately gives them the remedy for what they're feeling, leaves the compartment to talk to the driver. It's not before reminding them, please eat the chocolate. Then comes back and is like, I haven't poisoned the chocolate. Nobody's touching the chocolate. It's just everybody's like so distracted catching up.
I mean, in fairness, let's not forget how he was introduced at the start of the chapter, and you're just going to take chocolate out of a strange man's pocket. Like,
I mean, chocolate is really good. If he seemed to have just defended me against this massive attack, this creature I know nothing about,
that's true.
I would eat what he gives me.
It's also the 90s. You know,
That's true.
Would you take chocolate from this guy on a train now? No. But in the 90s, would you? Yeah, probably.
A lot of things were more acceptable back then, for sure.
I think by this time it's also called out by Hermione that Lupin is likely the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Well, we're not at Hogwarts yet, but the Hogwarts Express is an extension of the school. So we have to talk about how this is a security nightmare, right? Dementors boarding the Hogwarts Express. And this is a lesson on how the Dementors cannot be controlled by the Ministry, by Hogwarts. And it's probably another reason Dumbledore doesn't want them there in the first place.
Yeah, among other reasons. But as to whether it's a proper security nightmare, I'm not sure, because isn't it passed off within this chapter as a security check? The reason they're aboard is to search every compartment for Sirius. This is why Remus says, we're not hiding Sirius. And later it is said that they did a security check. I think Dumbledore might even say it or contextualize it that way. Whether or not it was intentional, planned beforehand, the Dementors are very rogue. But that was the reason they're on the train, presumably, not to get a quick bite or a quick meal off of people, but because they wanted to search it before it came to Hogwarts.
But there are Aurors that could be used for that. You don't need Dementors.
And who gave the Dementors this order? Was it the Ministry? Did the Ministry say we need to station Dementors on the tracks at this point before the train reaches Hogwarts so they can search the
I doubt they would have
Express,
gone that far, but I can see the Dementors, who may be looking for actually a quick meal, seeing it within their purview to go and do this. Plus, I mean, security is only as strong as its weakest link, right? If they don't search the train when Nick comes in, how are they to ever get a hold or a handle on contraband? And
there's just a lot of questions here. Why not search the train before it left? Like, as far as we know, the train doesn't make any other stops between King's Cross and Hogwarts. So you're assuming that Sirius jumped on a speeding train at some point during the trip, which seems a little bit outlandish.
Yeah, I also just find myself wondering how intelligent Dementors are. I always get the impression that they just sort of do what is in their nature. And whether you're good or bad, whether you deserve the Dementor's kiss or not. Yeah, if they come across you and you're vulnerable and there's nothing stopping them, they will come after you. They will turn you into dinner for that evening. And I don't know if the Dementors are sort of like intelligent enough to have the conscious agreement between them to say, okay, y'all stay at Hogwarts, you watch things here. This crew, we're all going to go and check the Hogwarts Express. So that's what makes me wonder if they were sent there by somebody to search the train.
Yeah, it's a good question.
It is a good question. And along those lines, I was wondering if Dumbledore intentionally put Lupin on the train for this very reason, right? If we think back to, well, last year we weren't on the Hogwarts Express, but even future books, we don't see adults on the Hogwarts Express very often, much less professors going to school, right? Quirrell is already there. Lockhart is already there. And, Moody shows up the way he does in the next book. Umbridge is already there. So it's interesting that Lupin should be on the train to Hogwarts. I think
right
it was
place
intentional.
at right time. Yeah.
Right place, right
Especially
time.
because so few adult wizards can do Patronuses. Period. It's a big deal that anyone can. The thing there's your security nightmare. Just the fact that the train itself doesn't have more adults on it. Even to save the kids from each other. Like, things really could devolve on there, and there's no adult supervision. The trolley lady questionably canonically has maybe some capacity to stop disaster from occurring or instigate it. But who's the driver? The driver who's mentioned twice in this chapter at least. And what is their capacity? Are they an Auror? Are they an ex-Auror or somebody that is on loan from the ministry that can handle real disaster? Because the Hogwarts Express is a target from strategically. I know we're not in wartime, but you usually tend to guard something like this, the method of transportation for the next generation of young witches and wizards that's like going through the open countryside, both Muggle and wizarding. There'd be more adults on it.
Well, and also just think about the protection that Harry got going to King's Cross. You'd think then that they would extend that protection for his trip to Hogwarts.
Yeah. It definitely feels like there's this presumed safety. Once you're on the train, you're effectively at Hogwarts, right? You are on the Hogwarts Express. It's a direct, ride to the castle. There aren't any stops being made except for this one that happens. So it feels like the presumption is that once Harry's on the train, he's safe. Clearly, that's false. I do want to call out something related to the Dementors and the discussion we just had about whether or not they were sent there. Justin in the Discord is positing that maybe it was Umbridge, because she's always involved with Dementors. She actually sends the Dementors to get Harry in Order of the Phoenix in the beginning. I don't think we have a timeline or really know exactly where she is canonically at this point in the series, but it would be a great connecting the threads moment between books 3 and 5 if she were somehow involved in this.
I like it.
I love it.
Well, we do make our way to Hogwarts, and once we get there, McGonagall pulls Harry and Hermione, not Ron, into her office, and we also see Madame Pomfrey, and she's looking in on Harry, right, after this Dementor attack, and she says, "I suppose you've been doing something dangerous again." And this is not my note, this is Andrew's note, but he says it's pretty inappropriate for a nurse to say.
Wow.
I mean, Harry's the one who's always getting up into trouble. I don't think it's that far-fetched.
It's a little unfair, a little bit, but that's Madame Pomfrey's personality. That's why she's so funny, is she's always so harassed about the kids coming in that are getting into danger and not taking health seriously. I mean, she's kind of onto something. If you really want to get into like how many people are injured and how many she sees on a day-to-day basis, but this whole conversation about whether Harry is well enough to even attend the feast that comes up serves to remind me that I just wanted to talk about how sad it is that Harry is shaming himself for fainting. It's a very, we know later there's many reasons for why this happens. He asks Lupin, it's a big moment for his character, but he spends the next, I think, few months really feeling bad about the fact that he fainted. And there should just not be any of that stigma about feeling weak. There should be more people, I think, proactively, especially the adults, saying it's okay that this happened to you. And that's not really there. Harry just really is allowed to sit in his thoughts and feel like lesser of a person for fainting.
You could have had Dumbledore step in.
I faint all the time, Harry. I am 150 though.
I like how you use the word weakness, though, because I think that's exactly what it's looked at by
certainly Malfoy. Pretty
much anybody on the outside looking in who aren't Harry's friends, right?
Malfoy. And
we see Malfoy, Crabbe, Goyle continuously make fun of Harry throughout the course of this book for in fact fainting. But you were talking about Madame Pomfrey's humor and her wit, and it comes through again because Harry mentions to her that Lupin had already given him a bit of chocolate, and she says, "Did he now? So we finally got a defense against the dark arts teacher who knows his remedies." It's nice to see we have a professor who knows what the hell he's doing.
Finally. Yeah, it's always nice when a teacher is shown to, or a staff member is shown to compliment and really believe in the abilities of another staff member. You always like to see that, I think, growing up in real life too. Whenever you get like a teacher you like gets a good compliment from somebody else that's a teacher. So that's really neat.
She's also very salty in the scene about Dementors being around the school. Because if you were her, you got to presume this is the first of many incidents that you're going to have throughout the year.
Oh, absolutely. Not to mention just general malaise and like more issues that she alone is not equipped to deal with. She knows Hogwarts doesn't have a guidance counselor or a psychology department. Like, she's the one who's going to have to start treating people for sadness.
Definitely. And one of the other things that happens in this scene that could definitely be very much overlooked, because let's not forget, it was Harry and Hermione that were pulled aside by McGonagall. Why would Hermione be pulled aside? No real reason, right? I mean, if you're gonna pull her over for moral support for Harry, why not have Ron there too? But this is when McGonagall gives Hermione her time turner for the year. And it's one of those things that, like, blink and you'll miss it type of moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Harry is too distracted by feeling awful about himself to even question it. He doesn't even listen at the door. He doesn't go anywhere. He's just outside the door, but he doesn't like listen or peek, or he has no interest because he's beating himself up.
And it is an easy moment to miss, but it is even noted that Professor McGonagall wants to talk to Hermione about her class schedule. So it's there.
Yeah, that makes an appearance in this. It's so good.
Maybe you're led to believe she's taking too many classes or she's too overwhelmed and McGonagall wants to, get her in line.
Oh, yeah, maybe. But here's the interesting thing. Because this 1-2 punch between McGonagall and Harry and McGonagall and Hermione, these scenes have to occur as they do, McGonagall misses the sorting. When they get down to the Great Hall, the sorting has occurred. But wait a minute, isn't it McGonagall herself, the deputy headmistress, that always runs the sorting? Do we ever see anyone else holding Godric Gryffindor's hat? Somebody else must have done it. Who was it this year?
Hagrid.
That makes sense.
That would have been fun. I bet Dumbledore did it.
Maybe Flitwick.
Snape.
Can you imagine?
No. Eric, you touched on this earlier, but when Dumbledore is giving his spiel about the Dementors, and warning students not to kind of go wandering around the grounds, he says that invisibility cloaks will go undetected by them. That was a clear shot at Harry, telling him, behave yourself, don't go wandering around. But, this is a special invisibility cloak. This isn't just any old, what are they made from? Leatherfolds, demiguise? I forget.
Demiguise, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is Death's invisibility cloak, right? Surely it would have protected him from the Dementors.
We'll have to keep an eye out. I mean, I think even in book 7, when he's going to the forest to sacrifice himself, he is wearing the cloak, and he does pass by a group of Dementors. I don't remember off the top of my head if he started feeling the impacts of being so close to them when he was under the cloak.
He's so numb,
but it'll be
anything at that moment anyway.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch throughout the rest of this book and the rest of the series if we get any other examples of Harry using the cloak around Dementors and to see what the impact is.
Yeah. And then just wrapping up this chapter before we get to some odds and ends, we learn that Hagrid has been appointed as the Care of Magical Creatures teacher, and he's able to catch up with the trio after dinner, and he credits them with clearing his name after everything that went down last year. So we really have a number of new classes that we're going to be attending this year. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And obviously with Lupin now heading up Defense Against the Dark Arts, it seems like it's going to be an enjoyable year there as well.
Yeah, here's where I think the movie differs. This, for me, even though we've had this crazy scene with the Dementor on the train, there's a lot that Harry is genuinely looking forward to. The chapter ends with him feeling like he's at home finally. And it's just this really uplifting, warm thing. Nothing is weird, nothing is awkward, except for this threat of the Dementors and Sirius Black, but everything feels very good. They clap for Hagrid. They're just this loud celebration. It's pretty much, there's no Hogwarts without you, Hagrid. But for this year, And it's just extremely touching.
All right.
All right. Well, we'll be moving on to some odds and ends here in a moment. But first, I got to ask you guys, what's something you can wear that you can't see, but can help you feel better after an encounter with a Dementor? If you guessed underwear, then reward yourself with super soft undies from MeUndies. If you guessed wrong, still reward yourself for trying. MeUndies believes comfort is key. That's why they make magically soft undies in fun prints and tons of colors. Since they're obsessed with helping you feel your best, unlike the Dementors, MeUndies is offering 25% off plus free shipping on your first order. MeUndies offers cloud-like comfort for your butt that once you try, you'll be asking yourself where it's been all your life. The designs they have are so adorable, from animals to avocados for all you millennials out there, to even Harry Potter. For all you creatures of comfort, MeUndies has a membership that hooks you up with the coziest loungewear, bralettes, and undies from extra small to 4XL. Every single month, comfort and convenience. What more could you want? Members also get up to 30% off select items, exclusive deals, and early access. Yeah, you probably want that too. To get 25% off your first order plus free standard shipping, visit MeUndies.com/MuggleCast. Remember, if you're not satisfied, your purchase is on MeUndies. Again, you're going to want to head over to MeUndies.com/MuggleCast to get 25% off your first order plus free shipping.
All right, let's do some odds and ends from chapter 5. There is hints of someone untrustworthy being afoot. Harry's sneakoscope goes off on the train in the compartment with the trio, Lupin, and of course, Scabbers. And then Ron mentions that it went off as he was tying it to Errol to send to Harry. And so is this a intentional misdirect? The reader would assume it's going off because of Lupin, just based on how we're introduced to him. But it's also concerning when you think about the school's history with Defense Against the Dark Arts professors, right? We have Quirrell and we have Lockhart as the basis for comparison right now. So one would think that Lupin is not a good guy.
Yeah, it's definitely a misdirect. But we're also led to believe that maybe this sneakoscope is just faulty. Ron noted that it's not a very good one.
Isn't that a red herring, or isn't it? It's a misdirect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a like treat every time you read this, and this is like a good reminder for me too. Every time we hear the sneakoscope going off, treat it as if it's 100% accurate, because Peter. I mean, it is. It is. Yeah, that's just the greatest thing. I mean, sometimes
but we just don't know why.
If you can't figure it out, it's usually because Peter's around. Scabbers is there, but yeah, just we're meant to believe it's bad. They keep talking about how it's bad. Harry throws it in a damn sock. But yeah, it's totally accurate.
I also think it's one of those situations too where you're meant to assume that because Ron purchased it for Harry, it's less than, right? It's not as good as like the best quality sneakoscope that's out there.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's actually doing its job really well. And I think you can even make a comparison to Ron there too, right? Like Ron always gets the short end of the stick, but he's actually pretty good. So we also get a quick mention of the Defense Against the Dark Arts position being cursed in this chapter. Just a passing reference, but worth mentioning. We also get a little bit of history on Hogsmeade. And it's said that the inn, and I don't know if this is the Three Broomsticks or there's another inn that's there, was the headquarters for the 1612 Goblin Rebellion. And I just thought that was kind of cool, given the plot of Hogwarts Legacy being all about goblins.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's maybe room to expand on that if they want to, because Hogwarts Legacy, of course, takes place a couple hundred years after the Goblin Rebellion.
We also get a tease of Thestrals, because it's noted that on the way to Hogwarts, their coaches are being pulled by what Harry assumes to be invisible horses.
Yeah.
And one of the more important odds and ends, I thought, of this chapter is as they are all going up to the dorms after dinner, there is a passing mention of how Neville forgets passwords. And we know that because he is a regular password forgetter, he writes them down. And when he writes them down in this book, somebody gets a hold of them and uses it to get into Gryffindor Tower. We won't spoil, but I thought that, again, it was a little bit of a important note that Neville forgets his passwords.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure.
I mean, we all do, right? Like, think about today. Like, I mean, Neville, you should not feel bad for yourself.
Neville needs one password. That's what he needs.
Just a real strong one.
Just a real password generator and manager so that he doesn't have to deal with this. Also wanted to note here a little connecting the threads moment. Harry notes during the start of year feast that he can't help but trust Dumbledore. There's just something about Dumbledore that makes you trust the guy. And I think this is a really nice contrast to what we see in Order of the Phoenix, where he feels completely closed out by Dumbledore and questions whether Dumbledore trusts him.
That's a really good point. Well, I think that does it for Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 5, The Dementor. But before we wrap up, let's give our most valuable wizard chapter, whatever we want to call it, of the week.
Really got to hand it to the reason that Hagrid can become a teacher is because the previous Care of Magical Creatures teacher, Professor Kettleburn, knew when to throw in the towel and say, enough is enough. I've lost some limbs. It's time for me to retire. And good on Kettleburn for leaving that role with his life still intact.
I gotta give it to Professor Lupin. Welcome to the series, Remus. He came in clutch with the chocolate and the Patronus charm in this chapter.
I think future episodes of this chapter by chapter should be sponsored by like Hershey's or Reese's. That
would be great.
And I'm going to give my MVP to Madame Pomfrey just for the sass alone. Much needed humor in this chapter. So thank you to Poppy Pomfrey. Well, if you have feedback about today's episode or the chapters ahead, you can pen an owl and send it to mugglecast@gmail.com or use the contact form on mugglecast.com to send a voice message. Record it using the voice memo app on your phone and then email us that file, or you can use our phone number 1-920-3-MUGGLE. That's 1-920-368-4453. It's time now for some Quizzitch.
Okay, last week's question. What is Professor R.J. Lupin's middle name? And the correct answer, the J, stands for John. Last week's winners, because we took a week off, we actually had over 72 entries, which is high for Quizzitch. So rather than read the whole list of names, I've picked ones that used an alias. And here they are, last week's winners: a feral furry frogwort, bang-ended scoot, bubbly googly jiggly wiggly swiggly tingling, crazy knees. I got that out, but now I can't continue. Crazy Kneasel Lady, Crookshanks in his wicker basket, Deep Cover Horror, Dementor's Hershey Kiss, I love that one, Dutch Hufflepuff, Fastest Thing Alive, Gilda Lockhart, Gummy Walnut, Harry's Favorite Shirt, Cageous Lisa, Lupin's Furry Little Problem, Scabber's Missing Toe, Smushed Golden Snidget, and the batteries for Andrew's vibrating broomstick, and Wolfie McWolf. So thanks to all who submitted. Congratulations. You all get points. And we will see you next week. Next week's question: who guides the trio to their first divination class? Very exciting. Submit your answer to the MuggleCast form, Quizzitch form on mugglecast.com/Quizzitch. Go to the website, click on Quizzitch in the main nav.
Don't forget, coming up in bonus MuggleCast, we're going to be talking about the recently announced/confirmed Harry Potter TV show.
And speaking of bonus MuggleCast, this episode is happening thanks to the support of Muggles like you. There's much more MuggleCast, over 50 hours of it waiting for you on Patreon. Pledge now at patreon.com/MuggleCast to receive instant access to ad-free MuggleCast, the chance to co-host the show, have monthly Zoom hangouts, physical gifts annually, and much, much more.
And Apple Podcast users, for just $2.99 a month, you can now receive ad-free MuggleCast and early access to each new episode of the show right within the Apple Podcast app. By subscribing to the show, you're supporting us just like our patrons do. Of course, you can pledge to our Patreon to receive many more benefits, like Eric just talked about. But if you prefer to support us through Apple, we'll hook you up with no more advertising, and you'll just get each episode of MuggleCast on Mondays instead of Tuesdays. Just tap into the show, and you'll see the subscribe button. Make sure you're following MuggleCast for free in your favorite podcast app. And don't forget, leave us a 5-star review if they let you.
And don't forget to follow us on social media. Our username is MuggleCast on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok.
That'll do it for episode 607 of MuggleCast. I'm Micah.
I'm Eric.
And I'm Laura.
Thanks, everybody.
Choo choo.
Choo choo.
Choo choo.